having heard the talks today, what do these four people have in common? Okay, first of all, we can assume that they do not have the same genome because we heard about the diversity of the human genome. So they will all have different SNPs, different single nucleotide polymorphisms, which will distinguish each of them. And some of those will be responsible for the phenotype differences that you see here, but also for the possibility that they will get certain diseases, the association with certain diseases, and with their response to certain drugs. Now, we also probably, so what do they have in common? Come on, somebody should be able to figure this out. Well, no, it's more specific than that. This came from Google Images by Googling the name Larry Gold. So these so these are four of, by the way, many Larry Golds. Okay, so when I talk about personalized medicine, and the reason I'm doing this, the reason Larry asked me to do this is I know less about this than any of the speakers, and therefore I'm more at the level of part of the audience, right? So I'm a good person to be directing this. And when I talk about personalized medicine to my colleagues, many of them don't think that this is a crazy thing, because they, I think, misunderstand it and think that what it means is that if we have 1 billion different patients with 1 billion different genomes, that we're going to try to make 1 billion different treatments for those 1 billion different people. And I think that if anybody who understands how the FDA works and how slowly it works and how expensive it is to develop therapies would know that this is not a plausible goal. So what we do mean, and this is just to key up the questions here, just to remind you of where we've been today, what we do mean is that we're going to use an individual's gene data, their genomic, their DNA sequence data, or by gene product, I mean the RNAs that they make or the proteins that they make, to first of all guide preventative medicine to give better health or to guide treatment decisions to combat disease. And that includes this fascinating area of pharmacogenomics, which is the type and dose of pharmaceuticals can be tuned to particular genetic differences. Now, most of the slides that I was going to show, other people have sort of already shown their own versions of these, but I was gone for 4 hours to the talk at the postdocs at the Health Sciences Center Symposium in Denver in the middle of the day, so I don't know if anybody talked about, I didn't hear too much in the talks I heard about lifestyle decisions and about preventative medicine. So did anyone show this, Larry? So this is a fascinating thing from just very recently. I saw it I think I saw it in USA Today, but it was also in the Wall Street Journal. And you can, there's a set of alleles that predict whether someone will respond to a low-fat versus a low-carb diet. And as you all know, it's one of the biggest problems with dieting is that people get so invested emotionally, psychologically, in a particular diet, and then when it doesn't work for them, they get really bummed out and they just quit. And so this group from Stanford has found some alleles that will predict whether you will respond to a low-fat or low-carb diet, and they've published this in the Wall Street Journal, and they aren't telling what the alleles are. And the last thing I will say, and to me, at least to my limited knowledge, I think that the sort of poster child for the whole personalized medicine area was really Herceptin, where this particular receptor-positive breast cancer, which was the most deadly and the one that the physicians most dreaded giving the diagnosis to a patient, became the one that there was a very targeted and specific drug for that 25% of the people who had this particular subtype of breast cancer. And I think that the profound implications that I have here, and then I will close and open it up to questions, but I think this is true for all of the opportunities in personalized medicine that we heard about, that there are profound implications, first of all, for the patient, because you want to be giving people only treatments that they have a really good chance of responding to, and it's tremendously discouraging and distracting for them to get something that's not going to do any good. Secondly, this is a wonderful thing. You normally think of better treatment meaning more expensive treatment, but I think personalized medicine offers the opportunity that we could actually cut healthcare costs by not giving people treatments that they won't respond to, and David described that in his talk. And then finally, and I didn't hear, maybe I missed this in the middle part of the day, but really profound implications for clinical trials, where if you take an unstratified group of patients who are very heterogeneous in their genetic makeup and run them through a clinical trial, you'll often find that the outcomes require a statistician to tell you whether it was effective or not, which already tells you that it wasn't all that effective, or you wouldn't have needed the statistics, right? Audience to ask questions, and then we'll sort of, I don't think we should all answer all questions, but we'll have somebody take a lead, and then somebody else who has a different view respond, and then maybe for the next question we can have others ask those questions. So please, audience, let's participate. Yes?
Perhaps this is for David and for Don. You know, what you're describing sounds really creepy. As a consumer, as a patient, as a member of, say, out there in the community, that all of a sudden my PBM is going to call me and talk to me about gaps in my care, or that I'm going to be asked to wear things or ingest things or have things around me that are going to report data to all sorts of unknown places. Could you talk a little bit about the issues of privacy and the issues of consumer acceptance or patient acceptance to the kinds of things that you're both describing?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. On the other hand, I think that to the extent you're going to be insurable, you're going to have to expect the clinicians who are delivering care, your PBM is your dispensing pharmacist in this case. And your dispensing pharmacist knows what they're talking about when they call, and to the extent you are doing something that is going to give you an untoward outcome, and we're catching it upstream, you should say thank you. And by the way, most of the patients are. I see a day where when we make these kinds of all surrounding care networks for a patient, and the patient just refuses to comply, it's going to have a direct consequence on their insurance premium. Because to say no costs everybody a lot of money. And I think that's the problem we need to deal with. To say no when you're doing it wrong and you're going to end up in the emergency room in the hospital at great expense is not just your problem. I think that's the way I look at it.
Don, go ahead.
We have a whole different issue when the pharmacist in India finds out that the consumer just found out he sold him a fake product, and the consumer wants to call the rest of the villagers, take the pharmacist out back. I think it's interesting about the privacy issue. There is so I work around the globe, and you can take the privacy thermometer around the globe very differently. The U.S. attitude about privacy looks like, to me, at a 100,000-foot view, is going to be, show me what's in it for me, and I'll give up my privacy. In the European marketplace, much more government influence, and frankly, I can't give the talk I just gave here in Europe without spending 2 to 3 to 4 minutes on privacy right up front. So the attitude in the audience is so strong that I literally cannot give the same speech. And it has some really interesting and funny and almost comical attributes about it. lots of countries, France being one, basically say all your medical information must be stored in this country. But at the same time, we want to use the internet and connect. And so your information is actually zipping all the way around the world, but theoretically, it's only going to be in France. Somebody didn't explain IT systems to the regulators, but so there's some really interesting kind of disconnects. But the most important disconnect I have is that I cannot even have a discussion without first at least making some kind of statement that says, that all practical purposes, I acknowledge privacy is very important. Now, the way I have found that most people address this, and the way that basically, I don't want to say takes it off the table, because you don't ever want to take it off the table, but what sets it aside and says, okay, it's okay to listen to this guy's opinion about everything else, is when you say the patient's information should be in the control of the patient, and they should have the ability to decide where it goes. Once you say that in Europe, you're fine. What I'm basically saying is the U.S. isn't demanding that. And I'm not sure I can say exactly why, but I can say Europe is.
I just wanted to respond to the creepy comment there, because my wife runs a smoking cessation program, and she gets a very high success. Her quit rate after 6 months is about 45%, whereas the national average is about 16%. And the reason that she gets such a good response is that she calls patients, she talks to them, and she checks on them to see how they're doing. And I think that people actually welcome that. And I think that one of the things that you get from the healthcare industry is, as long as you're providing the dollars, you're pretty much on your own. And so I think that, a healthcare system that does call you and check up on you is going to have better outcomes, just simply because somebody seems to give a damn about what's happening to you, right? And I think the other thing that I wanted to bring up was the way in which we incentivize healthcare. I take my car in to get serviced or fixed. I don't expect to see a successive series of charges based upon the mistakes that they made when they tried to fix the fan belt, right? They break the clutch after they fix the fan belt. That's their problem, not my problem. So it seems to me that, if they managed patients for a particular treatment and quoted a price for that, then it's really in their interest to introduce technologies that are going to reduce their fixed costs. And I think that's where changing the incentives for patient care are really are going to result in much better introduction of better diagnostics, and they get to choose what the best ones are. So.
Yeah, I touched upon that in my talk. I agree with you completely. There's no question that, first of all, on the first part, that patients do appreciate the calls. They absolutely say thank you, especially when they have chronic or complex disease and they really aren't certain about what they're doing. It's very rare where they say, oh, I only take orders from my doctor. And in that case, we call the doctor and say, your patient's not doing a thing you told him to do. Would you please give him a call yourself? Relative to this whole concept of pay for performance, which is really what you're talking about, I believe that ultimately can be done, but it can't be done today until the system is wired. Because if you ask someone to be accountable for something that they cannot see or influence, you're asking them to fail. And I gave the example of when I capitated primary care docs. They think they told the patient what to do. They thought the patient was doing what they told them. The patient was not doing it and ended up in the hospital. They paid the bill. So when we get that visibility so that we can actually report out, we can drive accountability. And then pay for performance makes all the sense in the world, and the incentive you just described would go away.
Okay, Dick?
Well, I want to thank Larry and all of you for a fascinating day. All of the topics are of interest to me, and I'm passionate about them. But back to the personalized medicine part, I'm a physician, former scientist, interested in technology, and I don't, I think about how I deal with the issues that you're pointing out in practice. It really is a matter of just-in-time learning. I couldn't remember all of those DNA snippets that are presented up there. I don't know everything about all the drugs that were there, although I probably use them in some patients and have to learn about them if I'm going to start them new in a patient. And so one of the things that is really frustrating is there's nothing about the electronic health record. We have a good one at the medical school, at least people tell me that, but there's nothing intuitive about it. You cannot, I mean, if I knew the date a person came or knew the person who was the provider, I might be able to go and look at a patient's record from before. I cannot search the record for anything. And when I do things, to write a single drug prescription in this system, I have to go through 9 clicks. And then I have to go get it off the printer. If it's printed, I sometimes can send it to retail. So you can sort of sense my frustration. The good part about it is that when I need information, I can go to the references, I can get into our library, I can go to UpToDate, I can go to Micromedics, I can go to sources. But those sources aren't organized very well for me. The books are, some of the drug information is, but when I have a question, I can't go like I would to Google Scholar and ask some of the questions that I should have been asking that you've taught me about today. So I don't know what question to ask in that, except that if I'm going to provide personalized care at the highest level in terms of controlling costs and quality, I need to have some help doing it.
I have a comment on that. I think there aren't many, if any, computerized medical record systems out there that actually, along with the data on the patient, have the protocol tied to the disease that you're treating. And I think you would find, if the physician community would demand these kinds of things their way, if they took the leadership and demanded it, and actually took an interest in how it was designed. They're so busy practicing medicine. It's usually not physicians who are doing the design work. And as I said earlier, most physicians are kind of resistant to the concept of the checklist, the Atul Gawande checklist or evidence-based protocols, because they're afraid Big Brother's telling them what to do. But if we could at least go far enough that physicians said, you know what, this would help me keep current, because I can't read all these medical magazines each and every month when they come out, and I can spend more time with the patient and I can protect myself from malpractice. If the physicians would demand it with a uniform voice, I think you'd see the technologies evolve much more quickly than they're evolving today, to your satisfaction.
One thing that frustrates me is that I know I get almost everything that I want to get out of the medical record through Google, and there's an open architecture approach to the problem, and every other one is proprietary, and you got to learn each one, and they don't share information either. Interested in your comment.
Yeah, I would just add that if I was shopping for an electronic medical record, I would roll out every single record system that wasn't an ASP model, because it's the only way you can stay up to date. And otherwise you're buying into a proposition that you're going to buy an update every year or every 2 years. So it makes no sense, especially when you're thinking about trying to work towards accomplishing your goal. Essentially a cloud, instead of you owning the software, you're leasing access or rights to the software. So theoretically, you don't pay for the upgrades. It's included in your monthly fee, which means you're getting the upgrades. The problem you're going to have, and a lot of physicians today still have green screens from wise computer screens from 30 years ago, because they never paid for the upgrade. They didn't see a value in it. Well, we'll just go through that same process all over again.
So, Dick, one thing I wanted to mention that's a little far removed, but is coming online now, that's actually going to be really relevant, is that especially places where we're doing a lot of kind of very highly complex and interrelated data sets around proteomics and genomics and expression and time to phenotype, there's all of a sudden now this realization that there's just no way even for the researchers to access this kind of stuff. And so there's this huge effort that's just started undertaken in data visualization, where it's pattern, basically some of it's aesthetics, but some of it's really like pattern recognition. And how do you draw the real information out of the data? And some of these tools that are coming along are actually going to be hugely relevant, even on the medical side, where you're not going to have to know all the names of the SNPs and stuff. So those kind of things are bubbling up. So
Let's move on to Larry over this microphone.
All right, I want to shift gears just a little bit, and partly I want to blame Larry for this because he sold the rights to the actual therapeutics, and so the whole day has been fairly focused, I think, on diagnostics. I think that's fair, and I wonder how we're going to do personalized medicine. If we know a lot of details about exactly what's wrong with you and exactly how you metabolize things, but we still only have the list of a couple hundred drugs that we have, plus a few surgical interventions. And aren't we going to need interventions and therapies that are as personalized as the diagnoses? And isn't that going to have to come from some kind of combinatorics? We're not going to be able to invent a drug for everybody, but we've got to be able to come up with the right drug combinations. And you see little tastes of this in cancer where we have to hit several different spots in the pathway to actually get the effect. And maybe a little tiny bit in geriatrics where everybody's on a zillion medications anyway, and so we're trying to figure out how to balance it. But what do you think we're going to do to come up with personalized therapies, and what are they going to look like, and how are we going to get there?
Well, I was talking to Stephen Eck yesterday, and he's head of translational medicine at Lilly, and maybe he wants to comment, but to paraphrase, it appears that Lilly is completely behind and completely committed to developing drugs which hit the right fraction of the population to work, and accompanying them with a companion diagnostic so that you can show who the drug is not working in, and they have this for a fair proportion of their portfolio, and this is standard operating practice. I know that that's not true of every company. In some therapeutic areas, cancer, for example, it's more common than in others. But I think the industry as a whole is moving towards this idea that you can get super responders in some fraction of the population, and you can identify the non-responders in the other fraction. So I think they've already moved in this direction, and I don't know if Stephen has anything to add.
It's still kind of one drug at a time, though.
Let me just briefly comment. Yeah, so that is our strategy. I mean, we don't think that we'll get Erbitux level pricing, $8,000 a month, unless you get a big effect. I mean, I think the tolerance for that's gone away. So, our business model is we're going to deliver you something of big value if we're going to charge a big price. I mean, that's kind of common sense, and I think that's what's going to happen. That doesn't answer your question, because we'll figure out the segment that our drug works in, but if you're not in that segment, then what'll happen? So I'll get, for an example, work on a new schizophrenia drug, and we presented last year some data that the genetic segment that drug we think will work in. We have to prove it, but we're pretty confident we have that right. But what about the other segment? Will they just get the old crappy stuff? But I think market forces will come in and they'll say, wow, that's taken care of. I'm going to work on this other segment. But unless you know what those segments are, how do you know what to produce?
Well, imagine that it's sort of Zipfian, right? So there's a couple of big hits, right? You get 20% of people with this drug, and then 10% of the remainder with that drug, but then it really trails off. And you've got people that need a different therapy that are in a small subgroup, right? Their disease is, they share with a few thousand other people. It's not, how are we going to develop treatments for those small groups that, it doesn't seem like our system of developing therapies addresses that. And if it turns out the way it does with the diagnostic side, that in fact there are all these tiny subgroups that are going to need their own specific treatment, our model of one drug per subgroup is not going to make it. We're going to have to figure out something else, right? I'm done.
Paul.
First, I need to ask someone in this room to give me a prescription for headache. The mind-expanding experience has been painful today. I actually have questions on two topics. One is fairly brief. Someone earlier asked about the speed with which people flip through healthcare systems, and maybe this is going to get addressed with the changes that are being made. But we worked with a company once that developed pretty sophisticated technology for patient-specific diagnosis and treatment for prostate cancer, extendable to the other areas. And only the Kaiser systems were really interested in it, because the other systems said we're not really interested in picking up patients earlier in the course of their disease. So I'd love a comment on that, and again, whether that's changed. And the other is that, and this has come out, David, in some of the things you said, I had experience with automating a bedside automation system, captured data retrieval at the bedside. So we were faced with solving all the workarounds that sort of been pushed out from the central system that were still being handled by the nurses at the bedside. And more recently in e-commerce, where I've found myself surrounded by people who had great ideas of ways to transform transaction systems in a way that would make them much more productive, much more efficient, much more sensible, but they all required that the world, having operated a certain way up to one day, would go home on a Friday afternoon and all line up differently on a Monday morning when they came back. And the issue of where to step into that circular challenge of that wheel and get things started, and maybe it ties into your comment about leadership, and I would love a comment on that as well.
It's leadership, and it's bigger than re-engineering a company. It's complicated. It can be dangerous sometimes when you re-engineer a company, because you can sever an artery without planning on doing it. But it starts with leadership, and it's planning. And the third thing that I did mention is that you cannot fix healthcare with a big bang approach. You've got to do it in logical building blocks. One feeds the next, which feeds the next, and you get value from each along the way. So, you know, when we reform healthcare, we start with wiring the system. And then my view is we start with solving those fundamental problems around chronic and complex disease I talked about. And then once you solve for that, it lends itself beautifully to the tort reform I talked about. So you can't do them all at once. And by the way, once you get to protocols and a wired system, you absolutely can change from fee-for-service to pay-for-performance. But what are the logical steps in any environment you're in? That's how anyone running a big company goes about re-engineering their company to make it smarter and perform better. And that's what we need to do in healthcare. And it's not a political process. It is truly a management and leadership process. And I think that's part of our problem right now.
I have a comment on the prostate example. In a way, you can argue that we already detect prostate cancer too early, because it doesn't kill most of the people if it was left alone, and there's a huge cost to detecting it very early. And what we really need is to discriminate between the cancers that will at some point grow rapidly and kill, and those which will not. And so it's not always that early detection is better. It may be something else.
So I think in order to get through the questions, let's move over to here.
Well, it's been a very exciting day listening to all of the marvelous products and all of the great diagnostics that are just around the horizon. I do wonder, though, in the last hour, we got to hear Tom Cech's example of what might happen if some of that diagnostic and scientific scrutiny goes to something like diet, something where looking at the genetic characteristics of a person could help them make a decision that would give them incentive to choose something that might really work for them. This gentleman here was talking about smoking cessation programs and how they too, if we look at them, can have a strong outcome-based result. With all of the focus on products and the importance of products in our society, where's the incentive for those kind of outcomes to be looked at with equal force to the kinds of products? Where's the incentive to encourage people to get healthy enough on their own that they can actually take less drugs?
There actually is quite a bit of incentive. We're talking, I don't know if it's the company that Tom mentioned or somebody else, but we're talking to a company that has a fascinating technology that puts you into one of 4 categories relative to what type of diet's best for you. And, you know, so if I have, in my 65 million member population, I have 5 million complex diabetics. I have another at least 5 million pre-diabetics with obesity problems, which you could turn it around if you could get to them. They could avoid diabetes if, in fact, you could turn them around. The clients that hire us would love it if we could help get those patients on the right diet, tied to the right genome, and we're having those conversations right now. And what the incentive you would ultimately talk about is benefit design around those individuals tied to their out-of-pocket premium for their health care. So when you do it in Medco's position with the, either the Fortune 500 customer or the health plan, you create the science to really make their diet effective, and then you create the financial incentive for the person tied to the premium, because all employees are paying out of pocket toward their premium these days. And you make incentives for their compliance with this thing and get them on the right track.
Is that also where the incentive would lie for you, that you would be in the healthcare business of seeing, you get rewarded for having them be healthier?
I obviously won't sell them as many pills. I'll sell the genetic test and probably sell the food that supports the specific types of diets that go with it.
So we're almost out of time. So Aileen's going to have the last question here.
Thanks, Tom. I've heard a lot today about chronic disease and chronic medicine and companion diagnostics. I work in a more acute area. We're in bacterial infections and rapid diagnostics for drug susceptibility. We've been pleased to see the legislation on a state-by-state basis that now is getting a lot of hospitals to screen for patients who are carriers. But my question is, of course, the reason that we're losing about 100,000 people a year in our hospitals, more than we lose from HIV, more than we lose from most major cancers, is because doctors aren't getting the antibiotics right. How do we incentivize physicians? How do we incentivize hospitals? Clearly, there's a medical benefit to getting the drug right and getting the patient out sooner. Clearly, in our case, we believe we're going to save about 18 lives for every 1,000 tests we sell. But how do we translate that on a general basis for acute companion diagnostics and get the medical care systems to look at this and prescribe antibiotics appropriately?
Let's have either Fenton or Don take a shot at this. Who wants to?
Anybody feel
Or
like they're the
maybe a
expert on this?
somologic view would be useful here.
I can tell you what Pfizer's position was, and it saw this as a very large opportunity. That MRSA infection is a big commercial opportunity and a high medical need, and they completely recognized the fact that any drug that was going to make lots of money would have to be accompanied by a companion diagnostic point-of-care test that would show the prescribing physician within 2 hours that expensive drug was the appropriate one for the patient. Now, I don't, that was 2 years ago. I don't know whether that represents their current position, but it was normal business incentives that they only made money if they could identify these people very quickly, and they were supporting point-of-care diagnostic devices for hundreds of thousands or millions a year to go along with their drug program, and I suspect that other pharma companies are doing the same thing.